All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us today. And thank you for joining today's webinar presented by InfoTrust on how ITP and other browser cookie expiration changes affect your measurement. It's a topic that we've been covering for a little while now. It's really hot in the industry if you're in analytics or digital marketing in general. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. Yes, we are recording this webinar. The slides will be sent out to you afterwards. Of course, we hope to have some time at the end for Q&A, but we can also answer as we go. We have a couple team members on this GoToWebinar along with myself. So we'll be monitoring the questions panel, the chat panel, and really feel free to ask as we go. We'll also be sharing our emails, the presenters, so you can contact us directly afterwards. That'll be on the next slide and also the last slide. Hopefully you can hear me okay and see my screen, but again, if there's any issues, please let us know. We'll try to resolve it and troubleshoot right then and there. But otherwise, we're excited for you to join us and talk about this topic around browser changes and cookie expiration. But first, I want to introduce myself. I'm Amin Shaki, the head of growth at InfoTrust. I'll be presenting this webinar along with my colleague, Rachel Joss, digital analytics engineer, and want to just share a little bit about us so that hopefully you believe we know what we're talking about. At InfoTrust, we support many multinational, multi-brand, multi-platform organizations across the world. We have offices in several different locations from the USA, also UAE. We have offices in Spain, and then within the US in Cincinnati is our headquarters, as well as Chicago, which is where I'm dialing from. And really we do everything for our clients around measurements, and a big topic lately has been how to handle all these browser changes. I've talked a little bit on the strategy side and what is going on with these changes, how you can address them high level within your organization. Rachel's going to be joining and talking a little bit more specifically on the technical side, how you can address that as well. But we'll cover the agenda here in a moment. As far as our credentials at InfoTrust, this is just a quick slide to show you some of the services that we do. Again, anything within the measurement umbrella, digital measurement, digital analytics, from strategy, measurement planning, architecture, implementation, testing, validation, analysis, insights, etc., but also in the compliance space and working with changes in the industry and just how to make measurement better for your business. We're certified across several different products, primarily with Google across the Google Marketing Platform, so Google Analytics 360, Google Tag Manager, and others. We're also Google Cloud certified partners, and we have a slew of other partnerships and certifications. We also have our own technology, a little bit I'll tease later today, called Tag Inspector. It's our proprietary technology to help with data compliance and data quality, validations. So we'll talk a little bit about how and why we build our own technologies to support measurement and accurate data collection. But we work with a number of different clients across the world that have varying different technologies as well. These are just some of the main platforms that we work with. As far as the agenda today, so the topic around browser changes and what's going on with cookies and why it's important to know what's going on and impacts to your measurement, that's really the purpose of the session today. I'll start by covering what are the recent browser changes, not Bowser changes, throw out to my dog there, but and specifically talking about ITP and what that is with Apple Safari browser specifically, since that is the potentially most impactful change or changes that have been occurring over the last year or so. Then I'll pass it over to Rachel to go a little bit deeper into the solutions and considerations for actually working with these browser changes, what you can do about it. I'll touch on it some, and then Rachel will go a little bit further into the technical aspects, so that if you are a developer or engineer on the call, hopefully you can get some ideas on how to address this within your org. Or if you're not, then you'll always be able to have that informed conversation with your engineering team or with our team as well. And then we'll talk about some next steps, what we've done with some of our clients and organizations to get started addressing these browser changes and how to really keep measurement stable, but also built for the future so that you can continue accurately measuring and making decisions off your digital analytics. Cool, so let's jump into what these browser changes really mean or what they are. So the internet is changing, and it's changing as a consumer for the better. The major players, major browser providers are understanding that since the internet was born, lots of new technologies have been built and rolled out, and lots of data collection is occurring, and the internet's getting more sophisticated, there's a lot more capabilities, but also with that, there's a lot higher chance of consumer data being shared involuntarily, and really there's a need or a focus for privacy for consumers. So various modern browsers, they're looking to make updates, and some have already, which we'll talk about, around specifically how cookies are set, their expiration, ultimately how online measurements should be handled. As a really big step back, what cookies are, for those that might be not as familiar, they're ways to collect and store information on the internet as you're visiting websites and browsing around. So a lot of customer data, whether it's anonymous or known customer information, can be stored on the browsers via cookies for use in analytics or advertising technologies, and even for things like logging into a website or just being remembered as you're coming back to the same website over and over again. So these are ways to capture and store information as you're navigating the internet, and the modern browsers are putting a little bit more focus around how those are handled because they contain customer data, and there's some privacy implications. So the cookie changes or how browsers are handling the cookies today, and really the expiration, almost all the browsers are modifying how cookies are stored, what can be stored, how long they can be stored, the information that's actually contained within it. And we'll talk and show a breakdown of each browser in a bit here. But the reason we're talking about this and why it's important, and I imagine why you're actually joining this webinar, is because there's potential impacts to measurement and to digital marketing overall. So we wanted to list some of the key ones, the most important changes that we see coming out of these cookie changes, particularly reducing the lifespan or how long before cookies expire and get deleted or that information is lost. The main one that we see from a marketing perspective is attribution. So as users are coming to your website, your platforms over and over again from different sources and channels that you're investing in, attribution shows you all of those touch points leading up to a conversion, whether that's an e-commerce purchase or some kind of goal you set. And that attribution data or the sequence of touch points and sources that users keep coming back to the site through really rely on cookies. Cookies is how analytics platforms understand it's the same user coming back again and again, and ties that together over time. So really, attribution with these cookies being deleted in a much shorter time span or expiring and having more restrictions, that'll be affected or challenging and maybe not even possible in some instances because that information is being blocked. And we'll walk through a scenario a little bit later. I think Rachel will actually walk you through that when it comes to Google Analytics and attribution and information there. Another key metric or impact is around user level data that you might have within your analytics platform. Again, for the same reason, cookies are used by analytics platforms to understand repeat visitors or repeat engagement and just more information about your users. As those are being deleted or expired on a much shorter duration, that information will now be skewed because it'll look like there's a lot more new users coming back, even if it's the same user using the same browser, but their cookies were expired or modified, if you will. So new versus returning metrics and counts will be affected because of these cookies being deleted or refreshed and the implications there. Because of both of those situations with attribution, user level metrics, a side effect is also just remarketing will be much more difficult if you're using your ad tech and or analytics platform to build segments of users and audiences to remarket to or retarget. it'll be more difficult or less reliable, at least to do it consistently across all the different browsers, because the cookie expiration is going to be modified. And really that's where retargeting remarketing is powered by today, is primarily through cookies, as that is some information that's following you around the internet and what actually allows ads to be shown to you as you leave your particular site and go to other places on the internet. So remarketing will definitely be a challenge and impact due to these cookie changes. Wanted to summarize in a single chart though, the pros and cons with the cookie expiration changes. Again, I'll show here in a bit the specific browsers and how they're modifying cookies and what are the different types of cookies. But for the most part, there's pros and cons depending on which angle you look at. So of course, a pro, and really the impetus behind all of these changes is increasing consumer privacy and data safety. Because up to recent, up to last year, where browsers were not really making these changes, cookies were used in all sorts of ways to store and pass customer information, even anonymous, but detailed information about what they're engaging with and where they've been on the internet. It's been passed all over through the use of cookies. So by limiting or enforcing how those are set and when they expire, provides a little bit more safety and more privacy for consumers, more control at the consumer or user level. The counter to that, though, for marketers and advertisers, it gets a little bit trickier because cookies are such a critical part of analysis, attribution, and retargeting, audience building, some of the things I mentioned before. That's just a con and exchange for more consumer privacy. However, a pro that we fully support is the nefarious tracking and ad networks that were really just giving the industry a bad reputation. And what got us here, because there were so many ad technologies that wanted to share your customer data or your users' customer data via cookies across their networks and pass that around, it really made lots of consumers and advocates of consumer privacy nervous or just unhappy with how the internet's moving towards. Really a lawless place, I guess, of data sharing and of tracking of consumers. So now it's more power for the users, but a con that we see at one angle is that now a lot of the enforcement of data collection and data sharing, if you will, using cookies is now somewhat at the mercy of the browsers or the browser vendors, such as Apple, Firefox, Google for Chrome, and Microsoft for Internet Explorer, et cetera. Because now the browsers also are enforcing specific rules. Now, with a lot of these, and we'll talk a little bit about them, the browser vendors like Apple for Safari or Mozilla Firefox, they don't want to fully control how the internet works, how data is shared. They want to give consumers and developers more deliberate ownership of how data is actually collected, and just block the third-party ad networks, ad tech that might be trying to get around and consume more consumer data without consumers actually knowing or website owners knowing. But still, a little bit more control and influence from the actual companies that build and maintain the browsers themselves. So as promised, wanted to summarize in a single table some of the browsers, the top browsers that we've seen when we work with some of our clients and thousands of sites regularly. These are some of the top browsers in no particular order. It really depends on your business and what type of devices they're using, of course, but listing out the individual browsers and how cookies are affected or changing. And to talk about this, I should point out the difference between third-party cookies and first-party cookies in simple terms. From a non-engineering perspective, third-party cookies are ones set by domains or technologies that are not your website directly, or when a user comes to your site specifically. So when a user does come to your site, third-party cookies are set by other domains, maybe from previous other sites that they've visited, or just from JavaScript that's loading a third-party ad technology, ad tech, if you will, where first-party cookies, the actual owner of that cookie or the domain is your particular platform, your website. But it's set when users come to your site, it's about your site, it's about your particular interactions or your users' interactions with your brand. And the reason there's a distinction there is because, again, the policies and rollout of these browser changes for cookies and the expiration and or blocking entirely of cookies is to stop the sharing of cross sites or information that's not for a particular website users entering. So third-party cookies which are used to share that data across sites, even ones that users might not be directly on at the time they're navigating, that's going to be, for the most part, blocked by all of these solutions. Google Chrome has a little bit different changes coming up, where first-party cookies now have the actual limitation for their lifespan or the expirations being modified. Previously to any of these settings, the duration of a cookie life, the lifespan, the expiration setting, was done by whatever technology was actually setting that cookie. So for example, for Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, if those technologies are on your website when a user visits, they would check for their cookie that they use for a lot of their measurement or set a cookie, and that JavaScript from GA or Adobe or other measurement tools would actually input what the expiration is. So the browser didn't really have any enforcement. It was all up to the JavaScript and the code and the technologies that are actually setting or reading these cookies. For Google Analytics, the default expiration for their main first-party cookie was 2 years. But now with Apple, and we'll talk a little bit more about ITP, the expiration of that is much, much shorter, to 7 days or even up to 1 day, depending how it's set. But that's because it's considered a first-party cookie. It's on your domain as you're coming to the site, where DMPs or other solutions, ad tech, are at greater risk because they rely on third-party cookies that follow you around the internet and collect data across all of your or consumers' browsing behavior. Mozilla has a similar release, I guess, or capability here, enhanced tracking prevention. It's a little less specific or impactful than ITP, but Mozilla Firefox is exploring a similar 7-day cap, if you will, to even first-party cookies, but again, entirely blocks third-party cookies. But what that means for your measurement tools, again, if they're considered first-party cookies, it's limited risk right now for deletion or shorter expiration. Same with Microsoft Edge, which is testing out a rollout. And then the one I wanted to touch on a little bit was Google Chrome, because Google, as many of you know, they're an advertising company. They definitely push for advertisers to work with their technologies and push ads. That's how they make most of their revenue. But they also deploy Google Chrome, one of the most popular browsers on the internet. So what the changes that they're doing, because they understand consumer privacy is something that needs to be addressed and more control needs to be given. They've described and are rolling out capabilities in their browser to have users basically have more control about what cookies are being collected and or set and which ones they can delete. Instead of a blanket setting to block all third-party cookies or limit first-party cookies in a certain way, they are allowing more simpler controls for users, but also for developers and site owners to essentially label or set what type of cookies or define what type of cookies they need and are setting and are using, so that when users want to delete or block their cookies and tracking online, it'll be easier to pick and choose, if you will, or label which ones should remain or not. So it's a little less, I guess, impactful because it's not automatically blocking cookies. It does give more control to the users and developers both. This one's still being rolled out, so exactly what this is going to look like and how that plays out is yet to be seen as well. And all of this is subject to change. A lot of this is evolving as we go, but this is kind of the overview from what we've seen across the different browsers and how cookies are affected or changing today. So I wanted to take a quick pause and share, with everything going on, it might seem like there's a lot to consider here, and you might not even know what are all the cookies being set on your websites and by which ad tech vendors, and how do you actually get a handle of all of this, all of the impacts that might be happening. If you're focusing on just your measurement tools, your analytics platform, Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, and others, it's a little straightforward. But if you need to check what other cookies are being set by which ad tech vendors, We have our tool Tag Inspector, like I mentioned before, with some capabilities that can help you in this regard, especially with some free scanning capabilities. So when we suggest or when we bring up the topic of understanding, the impacts of all these browser changes and really getting control of your data and what platforms you're using, we always suggest starting with an audit of your advertising and marketing platforms with a tag audit. And what's a bonus is you can also see which cookies are set within our platform. So I wanted to show just a quick example of honestly something that looks a little chaotic, but this is a site scan from Tag Inspector, which shows within one website, which is this first node here, these are all the tags, JavaScript, advertising platforms that are being deployed and collecting information as users are navigating. So our tool Tag Inspector will scan the site as if it's a real user going page to page and see what are the technologies that are firing and how are they firing. And each node here, or each layer, is another tag that's being deployed potentially outside of your control or awareness, where these first tags listed here are ones that are either in your tag management system or directly on the source code of your site. And these are all ones that are being piggybacked or loading through other technologies. And all along this thread here, there's a lot of cookie sharing and data sharing between them all. So you can see if your site has something similar to this, there's some governance that needs to be put in place around what should fire, what data are these collecting. And honestly, if there's a lot of ad tech using third-party cookies, that measurement will change, especially because most are being blocked now with the browsers, and the first-party cookies are going to be limited. So it's really important to understand all the technologies that you have firing and get a grasp on that. But there's another quick feature, and I see a question and a comment have come in, so I can check that out in a minute. But within Tag Inspector, directly because of the regulations like GDPR and CCPA and cookie consent, as well as browser changes to how cookies are managed, we have a module here that actually shows which cookies are being set by which technology and in which method or what way to directly influence and guide the policies and decisions you may need to make around how you address the changes that are coming to all these browsers. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about how to technically address that and some solutions that we recommend on our side. Before I move on to the ITP slides, let's do a quick time check and then also see if there's a couple questions, which I'll address now, but also my team that's on can also check it out and follow up with an answer. And if any of these we will want to circle back at the end, I'll make a comment there. But first question, what makes a cookie first party even if it's being set by a third party provider to the site publisher such as Adobe Analytics, and not by the site publisher itself? I think that's a great question that maybe we can cover a little bit more in Rachel's section around the technical cookies and how they're being set, and more detail around first party versus third party from her perspective as a developer. So Rachel, I'm kind of going to throw that one over to you. And if it's not answered at that point, we can circle back at the end of the webinar as well. But for that question, I guess my initial answer, first party cookies, I mean, those are ones that are set and explicitly like owned or live within a single domain, if you will. Third party cookies are ones that kind of travel with the user as they progress the internet or as they go from site to site, different domains. If it lives and stays within one domain, such as yourwebsite.com, it's considered first party, even if it's set by a technology like Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, if it's isolated to that domain. But again, Rachel can confirm and kind of go into more depth for that. Another question, can you tell from which page exactly a particular tag is loaded? Great question, absolutely. I don't show it in the screenshot here for Tag Inspector. I'm assuming that's where the question's coming from. But yes, our Tag Inspector technology scans all pages of a website, and you can see for each tag which specific pages it's loading on or not loading on, depending how wide the scan is. But also, I believe with the cookie module, you can see which cookies are set by which tags on which pages as well. So we do a page-by-page scan and review with our technology. So that is absolutely possible. So feel free to check out taginspector.com, give it a free scan for yourself to see how that works. You'll have to put in a domain that you want our crawler to go through, and you'll see the page breakdown. Okay, so question about Chrome. For Chrome, do you know on what way the settings have to be changed? Should users see which cookies are required or add cookies, etc., via cookie management tool or similar, or does it have to be more detailed? It's a good question for how to handle, I guess, just cookies in general on Chrome. What I will say, the changes rolling out from Chrome, at least from what I've seen, are a little bit newer and I guess less documented. So as far as the settings that can be made by developers and or consumers for that matter on Chrome, it's a little unclear from my initial research. That being said, I think there's, based on portion of the question around cookie management tool, that's actually a really good point. We don't talk about cookie consent management tools like OneTrust or Evidon on this webinar, but we have and often talk about this topic in on our Tag Inspector side with some webinars and content there. A cookie management tool certainly is helpful on any browser to also notify your consumers that are coming to your site that you're leveraging cookies, and some of the tools, depending how you have it set up, allow you to control, allow users to control which cookies and or technologies they want to fire or not. The way we've helped our clients leverage a cookie management tool is really identify all the tags and technologies firing through Tag Inspector on the website or within a tag management system. Use the cookie management tool to essentially allow the users to approve or disapprove all tags or specific tags, and therefore their cookies from being set or leveraged as well. There's a lot more process, if you will, or applications for cookie management tools as well. But as far as should that be used or the Chrome settings directly for applying the cookie setting rules, if you will, you know, more to be seen as Chrome rolls out more of these features. However, what we've seen with a lot of our clients, particularly ones with European customers or bases and GDPR and regulations to be mindful of, a cookie management tool is recommended regardless. It's kind of an extra safeguard for your consumer data, and a lot of organizations are starting to require that, especially with CCPA rolling out in the US. I mean, that's a big opportunity to get a cookie consent or management tool out there as well. All part of the data governance conversation, which I'm glad to see this question. There's a lot more content that we provide on that topic as well. Hopefully that answers that question. Let's continue, and we can come back to the questions. These are great, keep them coming, but let's make sure we don't get stuck as well. Cool, so up to this point, I've talked a little bit about general browser changes and how cookies are going to be affected, particularly their expiration being shortened. But I want to talk about ITP specifically, which is for Apple. It's Intelligent Tracking Prevention release. And why I want to talk about this one really is because Apple is sort of leading the way around a lot of these privacy changes to cookies and expiration and how all that works, and other browsers and vendors are kind of following suit. But the main purpose for ITP that we've seen is it reduces cross-site tracking by limiting the cookies and website data. It's really meant to not break the internet or make it a lot more difficult for you know, honest advertisers and website owners to be able to capture information, but just to block any of the unwanted tracking on consumers as they navigate the entire internet. However, because of this, cookies within Safari that are set through document.cookie cap to a 7-day expiration, so there's implications there by default. There are other ways to set and store cookies, if you will, or at least set them. A couple that we've listed here, and part of our solution or workaround that Rachel will go through is some of the ways that we've seen more stable way to set cookies and to allow a longer expiration because you're deliberately setting it as a website owner, which Safari understands and allows versus through third-party technologies or JavaScript, if you will. So ITP is still evolving, as is all the changes across the browsers. So the solution we will walk through today, not guaranteed to work in the future, but we feel confident it's been one of the more stable solutions introduced and that we've tested and vetted as working as well. Quick shout out to Simo Ahava, who has kind of also led the way. He's an analytics guru, if you guys aren't familiar. He talks a lot about measurement, Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, and has spent some time working through ITP and implications, but also workarounds, and has a lot of great content as well. Okay, so ITP specifically and the impact to measurement. I've mentioned this a little bit before, but it reduces the lifetime of cookies. Therefore, attribution level, user level analysis and metrics are going to be affected. And really, what we feel as the challenge here is not so much the changes. I mean, analytics systems are always changing. It's the fact that it's inconsistent with other browsers, making measurement a little bit more segmented. So instead of only being able to look at attribution cross-browser or your user metrics across browsers in the same way, Apple now has its own measurement that you need to be mindful of. And if you don't do anything about it and just let ITP run its course, and as users are upgrading Safari to the latest versions where this is automatically applied, attribution user-based analysis, it's going to be possible still, but just with a lot of caveats and really with a lot of caution needed, as you'll need to start filtering and segmenting your account and reports by browser so that you can understand your Apple Safari browsers and users and interactions there versus interactions through Mozilla Firefox or Chrome, because measurement is unique per browser if nothing is done to unify that, if you will. And then there's other implications to specific metrics. And we have a lot of content on our website about how to check for the impacts directly in your analytics tools, specifically Google Analytics, like what volume of Safari do you have, and attribution changes, things like that in more detail. Okay, I've been talking a lot, so I'm gonna actually launch a poll to get some feedback from you guys, though I see a lot of questions and comments already, but let me go ahead and launch this poll to see if you've considered changes to your cookie policy. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see the poll that I just launched. Have you considered any changes to your cookie policy, or how are cookies set by your main third-party technologies, if you are aware? So there's a couple options there. We'll give it about a minute and a half to let people join in, and I'll stop talking because usually silence people understand that there needs to be some action. But feel free to post this in here. I'll see kind of the results as they're coming in and how many people have voted so far. All right, I do see a lot of votes coming in. This is great, a very engaged crowd. We have 65% of the attendees have voted, and that's climbing, that's great. And I will be able to show you the results, I believe, in a couple minutes once we actually close the poll. So I won't do a spoiler. I sometimes do a spoiler and kind of say what's in the lead here, but let's see if we give it just a couple more seconds for people to vote. We have over 75% of the attendees voted, so this is helpful. Let's see if anyone else will pop in to add to the poll. All right, we've given it about a minute and a half, so let me go ahead and close that poll and share the results. For over 75% of the attendees that have voted, here are the results. So it looks like most are in early stages and really considering how do we address this. Honestly, from our experience across hundreds of clients and thousands of sites, that's about where most of the industry is. There's a couple that are leading, if you will, maybe using a cookie consent management tool already and primarily based in Europe. So they had to for GDPR, which just kind of blanketed over to how do they address ITP and ETP and all the other browser changes. But don't dismay if you are in the group that you have not considered cookie changes or your policies and how cookies are set. There's tools and processes to do that. And by joining this webinar, you're already getting more informed. So glad to have you guys here. And thank you again for participating in the poll. Let's hide the results and see if I can go back to sharing. Poll closed. Go back to the slides. Okay, hopefully I'm back on the slides there. Still not the most natural clicking back and forth from the polls. Cool, so now we are, hopefully that was a good overview for the browser changes, ITP, and some of the implications at a higher level. Now we're going to, I'm actually going to pass it to my colleague Rachel to talk a little bit about more on the technical side, what's going on, solutions, considerations, and what you can actually do about it. So Rachel, I think I'm going to pass that back over to you at this point.
All right, thanks, Amin.
Sure.
You can move to the next slide. All right, so before we dive into the specific ITP solutions, I wanted to take a quick moment and talk about the browser cookies. I'll bring up first versus third party because I know we had a question come in about that specifically. But first, there's two main types of cookies that can be set on the browser. You first have your JavaScript cookie, which is the most popular, most well-known type of cookie. It's set through JavaScript code, and when you're placing your pixels from different vendors on your website, most of the time they're setting their cookies through the JavaScript cookie. The second type is the HTTP cookie, which unlike the JavaScript cookie, which is set on the client side, this cookie is set through a server-side script. The ITP only affects JavaScript cookies at this point, and the HTTP cookie is essentially unaffected as far as expiration. Now, the question related to first versus third party, when you're using like a third-party platform, such as an ad tech or other analytics platforms, so most of the time their scripts are running through your website. So you're placing a pixel on either the source of your website or through a tag management system, and most of the time that script is creating a cookie. So the cookie gets set under your domain because every cookie has to be associated to a domain or set of domains. Previously, a lot of platforms were setting cookies on their side, which would attach the cookie to their own domain. So you wouldn't have to go to facebook.com, but if you had a Facebook pixel, it would on their back end add a cookie to your browser to track you. So that would be the third party. A lot of platforms have since gone away with that, with ITP coming. So there's only a limited number of platforms at this point using third party due to the privacy changes. But that's the main difference. It's just where the script or where the cookie is being set, whether it's from the third party vendor side or through your own website. So hopefully that answers that question. You can go to the next slide. So from a Google Analytics perspective, we'll just go through an example of the _GA cookie as far as ITP 2.1. Another question that was brought up was with ITP 2.2, doesn't the expiration go down to 24 hours? From what we've seen, only certain platforms are targeted, or only certain cookies of certain platforms are targeted, most of them being ad platforms and platforms known to do cross-domain tracking. With Safari, they're definitely cracking down on the cross-domain tracking. So those are the cookies that they're setting to 1 day or 24-hour expiration. But as far as we've seen, Google Analytics and other basic analytics and some other cookies are still set to 7 days. So for the example, on day 1, we have a user visiting domain.com, and they get a _GA cookie written to their browser. Then it's set to a 7-day expiration rather than the 2 years that it was previously defaulted to. Then the user comes back on day 3 and the GA cookie is found, and it's available because it's set on the same domain that the user originally went to. And the 7-day expiration is reset. The same user comes back on day 13 and they're visiting the same website and the GA cookie has expired. So a new client ID is generated and the visitor is treated as a new user in Google Analytics. So that's where, when Amin was talking earlier about your new versus returning user metrics will be slightly skewed. This is just an example of how within a short 2-week window, you could have a returning user treated as a new user. Next slide. So to combat the issue shown on the previous slide, we can use a solution of HTTP cookies set from a web server to get around the 7-day expiration. At a high level, there's a few different approaches for implementing HTTP cookies, different architectures and technical implementations. One option is where you can deploy the solution on your own servers with the help of your own engineering team and, as always, InfoTrust for guidance. The other option is deployed through Google Cloud and your current tag management system. You would need minimal assistance from your engineering team, and InfoTrust completes the bulk of the implementation. Next. So this slide, we're going to deep dive into a bunch of different solutions. While we have focused most of the information around HTTP cookies, you'll see in options 1 and 2, there are a few options for utilizing browser local storage. Local storage is similar to cookies in the fact that it's a browser technology that stores information, but the way it works is more limiting, especially when you're talking about analytics tracking and tracking across domains. Options 3 through 5 are all solutions using the HTTP cookie. Option 3, set cookie headers in a server-side script, is implementing the solution on your own server. So we'll get into the details of how we're actually setting the HTTP cookie, but just know that you're using your own servers in that option. Option 4 utilizes an edge cache. If you're already using an edge cache for speeding up the performance of your website or any other needs that you're using in your organization, this could be an option because you already have the technology set up. It's basically intercepting the traffic and then rewriting a cookie on the way back to the user. And option number 5 is using a shared web service. So made mention of this before. It's the solution that we've highlighted because we find that it's for scalability and implementation purposes. That's the one that we've recommended, and we'll talk a little bit more in further slides. Side note at the bottom, testing, validation, scaling to all websites can be supported by InfoTrust. Next slide. All right. So how does the cookie rewrite service work? In our example, we're just going to say that we're using Google Cloud, but like I said, there's some other technical options that you can have. So when the user first loads the page, Google Analytics tracker is generated with the first GA event. The tracker checks if the browser has the GA cookie. If not, a new one is generated. Also, if the URL has cross-domain linker properties, then the tracker will use those parameters to update the GA cookie. Since this cookie that's generated with JavaScript through Google Analytics is susceptible to ITP, what we do is there's a hit callback piece of the page view tag. And what we do is we call out to a web service. And with that request, it returns a cookie with the same name, _GA, and with the same value of the existing cookie. This essentially rewrites the cookie that was already on the browser, but the type changes to HTTP cookie, which, as I stated before, is not affected by the ITP changes. So no expiration as far as that goes. Now, the one caveat I will mention here is the platforms that you're using that are creating cookies, they have to have functionality to be able to stop updating cookies. Google Analytics has this functionality, and you can check with other platforms on whether or not they have the functionality as well. But the reason you have to stop the platform from updating their own cookie is because anytime a tracker or any other script updates the cookie through the JavaScript, then it turns back into a JavaScript cookie. Next slide. So some considerations. ITP-like functionality may be introduced into browsers at any moment. Amin talked about that earlier with the Firefox and Chrome and Edge. They're all making changes. User metrics and attribution are already affected. You can see by your Safari volume the changes that are happening. And then the final thing is the solution may also change or get blocked, but it is unlikely since it is server-based, and when the browser knows that a website server, which is allowed to make changes to a certain domain, is setting cookies, then it knows that your actions are more intentional than a script that you're just placing on a website and you're not really sure what cookies it's setting or what it's really doing on the back end. So just the credibility of HTTP cookies is more credible than JavaScript cookies. Next slide. So checking the impact ITP will have. Using your digital analytics platform, whether that's Google Analytics, Adobe, or another one, you can check the browsers used by your visitors from Safari. A lot of times there will be a specific report that you can look at to see which browser versions, and you'll be able to see just the volume of traffic, especially from Safari. You can also build segments for Safari users and be able to review and compare to other reports. Some specific ones we call out are new versus returning users, cohort and repeat visit reports, and also review attribution models. We've also included a link to an article that discusses this further. Next. All right, so we've made it to our second poll. Let me fire up the poll. All right. Is most of your traffic coming from Safari that will lead to a significant impact and consideration from ITP? Now, I realize you may not have your analytics platform open while you're on this webinar, but go ahead and answer to your best ability. We'll give you a few minutes to submit your responses. All right, looks like we got 50% in. All right, we have one leader so far. Give it a few more seconds. Get your last minute votes in. All right, Close the poll and share your results. Looks like the winner for this one is not a significant portion, but we still want an ITP plan, which very smart because obviously you may not have a huge volume coming from Safari right now, but as you can tell, other browsers are getting on the bandwagon and making changes for privacy. So while they may not have as strict policies for cookie expiration as Safari does right now, most likely they're going to get there. All right. And Amin, I need to see the slides. All right. And I'm gonna send it back to Amin for next steps.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Time check, we got about 5 minutes, so I'll go through this section quickly since we did have a few questions that came in. Only a few slides here anyway, because we've discussed a lot about the implications and the different browsers and how to check. Our suggestion at this point, particularly since most of the folks replied to the poll that it's kind of new and we're trying to figure out how to get started with this, good starting point is review the impact for ITP since it's the most deliberate impact to your measurement. Check how much Safari traffic you have now, estimate in the future, use reporting and segments within your analytics platform, and then also run a scan with Tag Inspector as I showed before and better understand what's going on within your site, within your platforms, what are the cookies and tags that you have deployed, at least get a lay of the land so that you have a better understanding of how big is this impact or how big of an issue should we move forward or consider as you're discussing internally. The next step is considering if you do want to provide a solution and or unification of how your cookies are set, such as the web service, but is your internal team aware of the implications? So either there's kind of two schools of thought and kind of a hybrid, if you will. As we're discussing internally at InfoTrust, a lot of analysts are saying, it's just the changes that's happening to the internet, so we just need to shift our analysis and be ready for the new way, which might mean adding segmentation more frequently to remove Safari or look at browser-specific data versus always in aggregate due to these changes. Or, yes, we do want to keep our cookie policy or cookie expiration uniform for what it was historically, such as with GA in the 2 years, or just across our browsers, and what does that mean? So having those internal discussions with your website owners, but also your marketing teams, and really showcasing and sharing the implications with a no decision versus coming up with kind of how you want to approach it. We shared a couple of approaches within this webinar. There's a couple on our website, and we're happy to go into more depth for your individual use case if you'd like to talk more about that. But then from here, it's a lot of just typical project management with any kind of deployment or implementation around designing your project and then kicking it off and going through the steps. When we work with partners, a little shameless plug, we always like to try and think of our partnership as a journey together to get through different stages in the analytics maturity. But really the browser changes and core measurement is part of the crawl and data governance side here, but just know that to do all the fancy stuff with analytics and measurement and attribution and all this stuff, really got to make sure the collection piece is uniform and consistent. And that's why a lot of this falls under the data governance. And these are just some of the services that we provide with our partners, but really this is kind of key starting at the crawl phase to get that right. Another shameless plug for those that are based in Cincinnati, Chicago, or New York and or close to those, we are having a workshop around data governance where this will be a key topic, as well as just policies and regulations affecting cookies and cookie consent. So feel free to check that out, infotrust.com/workshop, because this will really be a very, very big focus for the topic. But I'm going to close off and actually open it up for questions. But let me throw up this poll. If you want to talk further about this, we're happy to do that with you. So feel free to complete the poll if you'd like to discuss further, or if you have any questions that we did not address. But at this point, I'll leave the poll up so you guys can provide your feedback, and then maybe Rachel and I, we can look at the questions if there's anything unanswered. I know there's a few that came in that we were able to answer, but we can take a look if there's anything not addressed. So let me do this. I'll pull up the questions, and Rachel, if there's any that I think you can chime in on, I'll let you know. Most have been answered and hopefully seen. Let's see here. We'll check this question. We have a large portion of Safari traffic, but we also make use of user ID views in GA and add a user ID with each tag when the user is logged in. Like this, only logged out visitors, customers are affected in GA. The rest are joined via their user ID rather than the client ID. More of a comment, but I think yes. Really, that is one major shift with a lot of these changes to the browsers. We're starting to see and encourage our clients to think more about getting a user to authenticate or log in, or actually say, you know what, I want to be more engaged with your brand and platform, because logging in, using user ID and all of the account-based measurements for a user that has an account and logs in, really that's going to remain. That is stable, and that is actually more rich information because you have more engaged, loyal customers. So if possible, whether you're an e-commerce platform or other, if there is account creation and value for your consumers to do so, that's what we encourage, and that's kind of a shift that this is pushing us towards versus just non-authenticated platforms as well. Another comment that I agree with, A/B testing will also be affected by this frowny face. Big frowny face, yes, there are implications with A/B testing platforms because they rely on cookies heavily. To see the exact implications, however, will yet to be seen. It really depends on your experimentation strategy. My 2 cents is oftentimes experiments do run for multiple weeks on end, where the 7-day expiration of cookies might be affected. Also, you know, the web service that Rachel walked through is specifically for Google Analytics as an example, because we can modify the cookie settings within those tags and that technology. Other platforms might not have a capability to modify the cookies in the same manner, and those are, you know, at the mercy of the browser settings directly. But if there is a technology that has a way to modify the cookies and you can leverage the web service, that might be a solution that can solve for A/B testing. Or your experimentation strategy will need to be mindful of which browsers you're targeting in your audience groups, and the duration you're looking at the data, and you know how much of that volume will be returning users beyond the 7-day window or what have you, and how can that be affected as well. But we agree, yeah, there's definitely some implications there, and we're happy to talk more through that if you like. I know we're at the top of the hour, and most questions have been answered, but let me see if there was at least one question that might be good for Rachel to jump in on during her section. Yeah, I guess one question, Rachel, that maybe you can jump in on is ITP and these browser implications, particularly to cookies placed by ad serving platforms like Campaign Manager, or not to give away my answer, I guess, but the third-party platforms. Do you have any additional comments you want to add around how those might be affected? For example, Campaign Manager, when an ad is served and a cookie is placed on the browser, what implications does that have? I don't know if you have any other commentary around that, Rachel.
I think we're still at the beginning stages, especially since they're now limiting specific platforms, which most of them are, I think, ad platforms, just based on the cross-domain tracking nature that they are. I know a lot of the ad platforms are trying to do technology such as link decoration and fingerprinting, which I know Safari is also trying to crack down on. So definitely more to come on ad platforms and how ITP and other browsers are going to be affecting those, because I think that's where ITP originated from, was ad and tracking across browsers when users are not aware. So I guess more to come.
I guess one topic, and maybe we can close with this if there's no additional questions, is question around the issue with a payment portal or platforms that are not ad tech, but more site functionality that leverage cookies. Things like persistent user logins and things of that nature. Is that going to be under the same scrutiny as the third-party cookies or other first-party cookies set by third-party JavaScript? Or is there any kind of options for those? So I kind of provided my answer, but Rachel, I don't know if you want to add some flavor to that.
Yeah, so non-ad tech, obviously the first-party cookie, you're looking at the 7-day in Safari for that right now. There's other ways to store the data if your platform is open to using local storage or things like that. But it is less stringent for those type of platforms.
None of the browsers want to break the internet or really cause a lot of headache for the sake of privacy. They're just trying to make it harder for the advertising, third-party, unknown data sharing, to kind of summarize on that. So I'm sure there'll be changes if it seems painful now and enough volume. The browsers will make it a little bit more easier for sure. All right, well, I think we're 5 minutes over, but thank you for those that stuck around and thank you for joining. Hopefully this was useful for you guys. So any other questions that we did not get to, we'll try to follow up either in email or feel free to reach out to us directly. Sharing my email and Rachel's email if you have any other questions for us. But again, thanks so much everyone for joining. Sorry we went a little over, but if you have more questions, comments, feel free to reach out. The recording and webinar slides will be shared as well. And thanks Rachel and team for coordinating this. So have a good day, everybody. Thank you.